Dr. Grishma Shah, and I'm the co-convener of National Ability Summit. Professionally, I'm an entertainment psychologist and an artist, and I live in Chicago. And I actually work to make Hollywood and Bollywood more inclusive. I have wheatish skin and very big eyes, according to me. My hair is in a bun, and I'm wearing a polka dot dress over a yellow sweater. And one of the reasons why we think digital accessibility is so important is because NAS has become this disability think tank, and we want to be able to share learning curves through concrete action points that we can take forward as a collective in different parts of the world and in India and even in Chicago. And it's difficult to deny that digitalization has come such a long way, but very quickly because of COVID-19. And that's why we feel that it's really important to talk about, where the challenges are, where the solutions are in terms of digital accessibility. And we're so proud to have Shilpi as one of our moderators, because Shilpi comes with over 25 years of experience focusing on implementing accessibility to customers worldwide. And of course, Shilpi wears many, many hats. She's the founder of BarrierBreak, 247 Accessible Documents, and Newshook. And she's on the board of many amazing initiatives. One initiative is a non-for-profit where she's on the board of directors. It's called G3 ICT, and it promotes digital accessibility around the world. Not to mention, Shilpi's won many awards and has been on many impressive lists, such as the top 15 Women Transforming India list and top 20 most powerful women in 2017, according to Business Today magazine. Hi, Shilpi.
Hi, Grishma. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, and I'm so glad to be able to pass this baton to you.
Thank you so much. So thank you for having me here. I'm just going to describe myself before I bring on my panelists. I am a 5 foot nothing, is what I say, a short woman in India. I've got long hair. I am wearing a purple color sari with a green blouse. I thought I'll wear my Indianness on my sleeve today. Looking forward to this conversation. Today, I've got with me Meryl as well as Dave Hoffer. Meryl is, a solo marketing consultant, has been for over 20 years. She's from Texas. She is an author and a contributor to books on business and technology. She helps B2B and accessibility companies rock their content marketing initiatives. Prior to striking out on her own, she worked for 2 Fortune 500 companies and the FAA. A highly sought after speaker who happens to be deaf, Meryl is renowned for sharing her personal experiences and passion for accessibility and high quality captioning. Meryl is somebody I admire. Every time I read her post, I learn a lot. So Meryl, it's lovely to have you on this panel on digital accessibility. Do you describe yourself so that we can get the audiences to know more about you?
This is Meryl Evans, pronoun she, her, and I have shoulder length curly hair, pale skin, a prominent nose, and a lavender top and glasses. You may have noticed I have an accent. That's because I was born with it, as I am profoundly deaf. Anyway, my accessibility career took off 2 years ago when I was invited to present an Act in Accessibility conference. I work with 2 notable accessibility companies in accessibility marketing consulting. And I've been speaking at many events around the world. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Meryl. Lovely to meet you today and looking forward to this conversation. In addition to Meryl, we also have Dave Hoffer. And Dave is the user experience and inclusive design leadership roles within PwC. He is the managing director at PwC. His goal is really to align user needs with organizational goals. And he spent his career focused on design. Happy to have you here, Dave. Would love to get a description from you, as well as to understand how you started off your career in accessibility.
Absolutely. I am a white male I wear glasses. I'm about 6 feet tall. My kids are in the background screaming at each other. Sorry. I am wearing a black sweater. I am seated in my home in Oakland, California. My background, I've got a background in design. I have been doing design work since 1994. I originally got my degree in industrial design, and then I moved to California and the web was just starting to happen. So I learned HTML and I've been designing for the screen ever since. And while accessibility has been a part of what I've done, it wasn't necessarily at the fore. It wasn't sort of the primary thing that I was doing. So in the last, I would say, starting in 2016, when politics became a much more important thing for us here in the United States and for some folks abroad as well, I started looking around at my career and the things that I was doing, and I started thinking about how I might change things, how I might help to redesign things. So over the last year and a half, I've been working at PwC, although I'd left in June. And I had been focused in the last year on inclusive design, which is bringing everyone into the design process, as many different types of voices as possible, and people, just to hear how they would design, and accessibility. And so I've been focused on those two things, certainly. And I will not, in the rest of my career, spend any more time not thinking about those things and not bringing those things to the fore. It's very, very important. And it's really a good pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Wow, I'm so happy you said that, because I met so many people for whom accessibility or inclusive design happens for a short stint in their career, and then they go on to the next job and forget about it. But we really need exactly that culture and that thought process to be able to take accessibility and inclusive design where it needs to go. So thank you, and lovely to have you here with us. So, considering today's conversation is about digital accessibility, I think, Meryl, I'm going to start with you, right? And I think it's really critical to explain to organizations the benefit from accessibility that companies can derive, whether they have, either products or services. So Meryl, over to you, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on how you would, explain this to companies so that they would buy into accessibility.
Meryl speaking. Think about the last time you went grocery shopping or traveling with heavy luggage. Maybe you like to ride a bike. What do all of these have in common? They have wheels. And it's not fun to go up or down the stairs when you have wheels. Thankfully, 3 corners have ramps called curb cuts. Grocery stores have ramps. Airports have ramps, escalators, and elevators. Multi-story buildings have ramps and elevators. If there are stairs and elevators next to each other, which one will you take? I bet most of you said the elevators. Personally, I like to take the stairs and get my exercise. But it's like ramps. Elevators were built for wheelchairs. So why is everyone using elevators? That's the curb cut effect. The initial purpose of the curb cut was to make it easier for wheelchairs to cross the street. The curb cut ended up helping many people: parents pushing strollers, travelers pulling luggage, skateboarders, bikers, and others. Making your website and content accessible will have the curb cut effect. Captions are the best example of that. At 80% of the people who use captions are not even deaf or hard of hearing. Simply put, you reach far more people with accessible products and services. Don't miss out on these opportunities. Besides, we all have 2 things in common. We all get sick at some point, and we're getting older. We are designing for our future selves. We can become temporarily, situationally, or episodically impaired anytime. When a person gets sick, they may not hear well temporarily. When you are at a noisy place with a TV, you are visually impaired and might turn on the caption. And people with migraines and arthritis experience episodic impairment that can strike anytime and change how they interact with digital products. Leaders who want to hear about the benefits of accessibility in terms of money. Here's one for you. The global economics of disability has found people with disabilities control $8 trillion in spending. If I did my math right, that's almost 600,000 rupees. I must have not done my math right. Anyway, thank you.
Wow. So you've actually, explained to us so simply from a physical perspective where you've got curb cuts, and on a digital where, let's say, you've got captions for a video or a talk like this, and the parallels between that, and the opportunity that there is for companies to implement accessibility and reach this amazing audience, which is including all of us at some stage of life. So why we keep talking about accessibility, right? There is a new term that all of us have started talking about, right? And that is about inclusive design. And there is often this conflict of understanding, are they the same? Are they different? Which word do I use and how do I think about it? So I think, Dave, that's exactly where you come in to help us demystify inclusive design and accessibility. And, how do you look at it?
Absolutely. Let me just build on what Meryl was saying. In terms of statistics, in terms of numbers, because oftentimes the organizations that we work in are very numbers driven, right? Impact, as we like to say. What is the impact of the work that we're doing? 50% of the world's global population is disabled in some way or another, right? And as we age, as Meryl said, things change for us. So for instance, for myself, I cannot go to a busy restaurant, although I haven't been to a busy restaurant for the last almost 2 years, but I can't go to a busy restaurant and hear very well. I've actually purchased a set of hearing aids in order to be able to hear better in a restaurant scenario. As I age, things change, and that's true of everybody. 75% of people with disabilities are using computers, and these numbers have gone up, especially with COVID times, especially being sort of in lockdown. And there's we talk about the carrot and the stick. So on the stick side of things, right, sort of looking for compliance within those standards, that the percentage of ADA Title III lawsuits have gone up since 2017, 181%. So that's one way to look at it. The more basic way to look at it that I always say is it's the right thing to do. And to your question, inclusive design and accessibility, the way I think about those items are as follows. Your tool or your application or your website available to more people, okay? They're a very, very discrete set of items that you can follow, rules that you can follow, the WCAG standards. WCAG is how I pronounce it, but other people pronounce it different ways. If you follow those standards, you can make your site accessible or your application, et cetera, okay? Inclusive design, I look at as an approach. It's more on the strategic side of how we build and how we design. And the idea there is generally including people on the team who have disabilities, who can help to make the things that we're building from scratch better and more accessible and easier to use. So that's the sort of the very basic way that I describe the difference between, it's not a difference. It's very much an overlap between the two things. Inclusive design is the approach, and it's the sort of the strategic way of looking at things, bringing people in, including people, inclusive design, and accessibility is the tactical expression of that.
That's very well put, because I think you've actually explained how both these, terms overlap as well as complement each other. And I think, that assumption that there is friction, and if you're doing inclusive design, that doesn't necessarily include accessibility, is taken away by your amazing explanation, because that is one of the myths that we see, that sometimes people say, it's separate, it's different. But like you rightly said, it's about an approach versus a standard to deliver on. So, with that, Meryl, when you go and tell people about, making their products or services accessible, how do you help them realize, who is responsible for this? Because there is this entire conversation of where does the onus lie and who is responsible for accessibility. So very often we find, take, video conferencing solutions like this. And I've seen you talk about how captioning should be available by default. It shouldn't be an added cost. So I would love to hear from you on how do you look at who should be responsible and your thoughts in that space.
Meryl speaking. Accessibility is not just the web development team's job. You can't hire one person to be the accessibility leader and expect the entire organization to adopt it. What is your role? No matter how you answer, accessibility is all of our responsibility. Marketers, they can ensure social media and blog content are accessible, and videos and podcasts. Sales can ensure the presentations are accessible. Video creators can ensure videos are accessible. Executives can ensure accessibility becomes a part of the organization culture. It has to start at the top to be successful. Managers can add accessibility to performance review. Human resources can ensure job postings are accessible and include accessibility in job responsibility. Teachers can teach children how to make content accessible. Professors can make accessibility part of their curriculum. Healthcare providers can ensure they provide accessible communication options. Whenever I go to the doctor, I sit in the waiting room facing the door, and I'm always waiting for them to come out. And when they do, especially with the mask, they say somebody's name, and then I look around the room. If nobody gets up, then it's most likely my turn. And I'll say, Meryl Evans, and they'll say yes. So they can come up with a more creative solution. Instead of calling out names, they could hold a sign with a name. What about like when you go to the restaurant or text people? Or when you go to a restaurant, you get one of those things that light up and vibrate when it's your turn. That's another solution. And then retailers, they can ensure those services are accessible. When I have to get COVID testing at a local pharmacy retailer, I had to go through the drive-through. It was the first time in 25 years I've lived by it that I had to go in the drive-through. And of course, they talked to me on the speaker. I couldn't see inside because the glass window was reflecting so bad. And the person had a mask. Thankfully, my spouse was with me, but that should not be the case. So you have to think of accessibility as 360, not just something digital, but also in-person experiences. The list goes on.
Wow. The examples that you gave, Meryl, make you realize that accessibility is really in everything around us and has to be in everything around us, and is so often ignored, right? And I meet so many people who say, but I don't work with disabled people, or I make a PowerPoint deck for my product. it's not for people with disabilities. They don't use my product. And at every stage you get that, negative approach that, no, we do not need to make this accessible. And you've said it so well. I think it starts with us. We ourselves in our own roles can start to make things accessible and get everything within our organizations to be accessible. So it is quite a journey ahead. And as all of us say, accessibility is a journey. So thank you for that. Those are very, very insightful, ways to think about who is responsible for accessibility, right down to healthcare providers, etc. So Dave, when you talk to customers, right, or you talk to organizations about inclusive design and accessibility, and because you also start from the design approach, right, from your perspective, who is it, that is responsible for inclusion in products and solutions?
From an inclusive perspective, it's a little bit broader of a topic. As we, and I say we, what I mean is, as companies, as organizations are beginning to be a lot more transparent about D&I, right, diversity and inclusion generally. Mm-hmm. And we're thinking about inclusion from the perspective of our BIPOC allies, our LGBTQ plus allies. We need to start thinking even more broadly than that, and adding to that list people with disabilities, okay? But it's a challenge because a lot of companies, and from a design perspective, a lot of companies are just getting to the point where they're including user experience design, designing for users, user-centered design as an approach to the way in which they make products. So from what I describe as a design maturity perspective, there are a lot of companies out there who are at a level of maturity where they're really just beginning to think about users at all, much less any of the users that I just mentioned. In addition to that, if you're talking about inclusive design, you're talking about having a more inclusive organization generally. And this is a challenge because a lot of organizations are, simply experiencing unconscious bias in the way in which they hire. So you see this in, Silicon Valley companies and just companies in general. People hire people like themselves. Oh, you're like me, and so I think we're going to get along, and it's a fit. And that's not necessarily the best way to make products, but it's just a way that people sort of work. They just have these unconscious biases, and getting past those biases is a big challenge. Hiring, retaining people in the list that I mentioned above is just it's a big challenge. You've got to recruit from different places. You've got to ensure that they're treated equally within the organization. And these are questions of how people interact with each other rather than necessarily design-driven decisions in a digital product or in something like a curb cut that Meryl was talking about earlier, or wearing a mask and being able to just communicate. So these are really deep-seated problems. And so as we talk to our organizations, as we look to join organizations, we want to begin to ask these questions to be more enlightened about how we approach the work that we do and where we do that work.
So Dave, do you see organizations being more enlightened today? And, where do you see us from when you started till now?
So from when I started till now, absolutely more enlightened, okay? The journey that I took as a designer was, how do we incorporate design into the work that we're doing? And I think that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations have arrived at the notion that we should have design as part of what we do. We can't just engineer our way past a problem. We're going to have to actually incorporate design. But again, it's a group effort. And Meryl was talking about that earlier. It's everyone's sort of issue. So design is really a broad topic. So getting to the point where getting just design to be something that was incorporated, that's one thing. Getting everyone to start thinking about diversity and inclusion and sort of broadening the windows and the apertures within which we're looking for people to come join the organization. That's a much broader topic. And I think companies are beginning to wake up to this. There's a topic, ESG, it's environmental, social, and governance. And it's the idea that you might examine a company from the perspective of those topics and understand if they're acting sustainably, if they're acting in a socially responsible manner, and whether or not you invest in that company or give money to that company generally. Those are topics that are going to get more and more broad and more sort of widespread as things go on. So I think we're getting to a point where we're beginning to be a lot more enlightened about these topics. It's just going to take time. And you know, my watchwords are patience and flexibility, right? Nothing changes sort of overnight necessarily. Some technologies change things overnight, but not mostly. Like cultural change is a lot broader and a lot longer term.
True. And I think cultural change will be required in the long term for this to be systemic and not that one-off initiative that organizations are taking on. You know, so totally appreciate what you're saying, you know, which then takes me back to Meryl. And Meryl, this time I want you to talk to us about one particular solution and how you know, what is your opinion of how captions can be made effective, as well as how we can ensure quality? Because, you know, to Dave's point of user experiences, we would love to hear from you firsthand about the challenges and, you know, what are the solutions?
This is Meryl speaking. So a lot of people think captioning is a matter of maybe just adding automatic caption and letting it be the caption for the video. But unfortunately, there's so many inaccuracies. 80% accuracy rate is not impressive. It's very bad. I mean, write down a sentence with 10 words and take out 2 words randomly, and you'll see it loses its message. Now, we have to think about audio, the way we speak is fast. So the captioners are amazing. They type over 200 words per minute. Now, it doesn't take much to have a small, here's an example. I was watching the Super Bowl on TV. That's the big football game in America. And there was a singer singing a very popular song. And I took a screenshot of one line of lyrics. It was one word, one letter was wrong. Instead of an F, it was it was an F instead of a P. And then one word was wrong. Now, if we just kept it like that, the screenshot, you can figure it out. But in reality, the next line that the song lyrics were popped up, and then the next one might have a mistake. Just one letter or one word is enough to confuse somebody who's reading all the captions. So that's why it's critical to be accurate. Caption in WCAG, as I pronounced it, I'm like Dave who says WCAG. Anyway, it does say to have caption, accurate caption. W3C has a page on captioning that specifically states automatic captions are not good enough. They're not equitable. So it's important to, the little things you do to improve your caption make a big difference. It's a matter of how long the lines are, where you divide the lines. There's a lot of things you can do. I love to watch foreign film. And I was watching a famous Academy Award-winning one from Korea. And the characters were scrambling around. I didn't have my hearing aid on, so I couldn't hear anything, nothing. When I take it off, I'm deaf as a post. Anyway, and all of a sudden the characters froze. And I'm like, what happened. I don't see anything, what's going on. And as time passed, it turned out somebody was at the door. The doorbell rang. Foreign films are notorious for not captioning sound, music, lyrics, and if they should start speaking English, they won't caption that either. If you're Russian, yeah. So yeah, quality captions matter.
You know, now that you've put that into perspective, I'm going to ensure I go and see all my captions very carefully of all the solutions within my organization first, because so often we just use automatic captioning and we assume that it will work, right? And you know, like you rightly said, from a standard perspective, very often we just check for, is there captions? We don't necessarily check for accuracy. So I think it's time for us to bring user experience and people with disabilities as a part of the process rather than separate them out, right? So Dave, you know, now that we've heard Meryl and, you know, she's given us a perfect, you know, solution, suggestions on captioning. And if I was to look at it from the lens of inclusive design and accessibility, she's also kind of articulated that to some extent. So what is the advice that you would give organizations who want to take on inclusive design as an approach, as well as meet accessibility standards?
Meeting accessibility standards is challenging because oftentimes it's an afterthought, and therefore there's the requirement for remediation, which is I've got to go back and fix all of the things that haven't been made accessible. Oftentimes teams look at this as, I'll describe it as overhead. Organizations that are very engineering driven might describe it as technical debt, but it's technical debt that fights with bugs, right? Making sure that the software works at all, and new features and functions that need to be added over time. So in terms of fixing, I describe accessibility as a sort of a monotonic problem. Right? It's just this continuous problem that that must be addressed. So where I live in Oakland, California, I'm very close to the Golden Gate Bridge. And one of the things they say about the Golden Gate Bridge is, you know, when they start to paint it, you know, they get to the point where they finish painting it, and then they've got to start immediately to start repainting it. So, you know, for things like the website at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I most recently worked, the website was, oh, I don't know, 50,000, 60,000 pages. New pages were added on a weekly basis, something like 1,000 new pages, because there were tools in a CMS that allowed people just to create new work. And there were, you know, approximately 100 pages that were modified over the course of that same week. So as they fix old problems, new problems might crop up. So it's a very broad and sort of, you've got to take an educational approach to get everyone, as Meryl was saying earlier, involved in the process of making things accessible in order to help to solve the problem and help to mediate the problem over time. From an inclusive design perspective, it's about hiring people who you might not have hired previously. And I think that COVID, if it's, I mean, it's done a horrible set of things, right? But it's also done some positive things, which is to say, working virtually is become, I would say, mainstream, right? So not having to have necessarily an office to go into. And I think what that means for a lot of companies is they're going to be willing to hire people from remote locations who can get on the, you know, get on their computer and do their work and meet on a Zoom call, just like this one that we're in right now, and get work done. And it doesn't matter where they are. So I think companies are going to be very aware of that moving forward, and will likely engage in that. And what that's going to mean is people who necessarily didn't have the same access, like I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, like I said, you know, living here is expensive. and it's not for everyone. It's a very expensive place to live. And so therefore, there's a very narrow set of people that you can draw from. And if you are not working virtually and you want people to come down to your office, you've got to be able to afford to live in the Bay Area, and you've got to, to come and do that. And that's one thing. But if I can hire people from Nigeria, if I can hire people from Ukraine, if I can hire people, in Bangalore or really anywhere else in the world to do the work that needs to be done, and it doesn't matter, then I have sort of a broader and more inclusive mindset to start. And I think that that's a really positive thing. But I think it's just going to take some time, and it's not an easily solvable problem. I mean, accessibility, even though we're very much aware of the WCAG standards, it's still a challenge to get those very specific things changed and fixed, because it's changing mindsets, it's changing minds, and that's a challenge in and of itself. So getting an inclusive design perspective is equally or maybe more so challenging.
That is interestingly put. So I'll give you my perspective. So at BarrierBreak, we're 240 of us. And, initially we were just a Mumbai-based company. In COVID, we started to expand our view and allowing people from all across India. 65% of BarrierBreak comprises of people with disabilities and across all different user types. And it was amazing that the kind of talent pool that we started to acquire by just opening our doors and just, becoming inclusive in our location and just using online as a method shifted for us, right? And we started to find people who otherwise we wouldn't have found, to your point, So thank you for that. I think it will open, the minds for a lot of people who right now might not think inclusively at things like this. I think Meryl also has something to talk to us about on recruiting. So Meryl, over to you.
This is Meryl. So I want to add on to what Dave was talking about recruitment. I know somebody who was interviewing someone, and he seemed a little standoffish, and something was off, and she realized she had to take a step back and look deeper. And it turned out the person was on the autism spectrum. So that's why we end up hiring so many people like ourselves. We click with them. When I met a deaf person that's a good friend of mine now, we clicked. We just hit it off. And that happens a lot. When I meet other deaf people who speak and relapse and don't sign, because we have that connection. So we have to learn to really dig deep beyond the person. After all, a lot of developers tend to be introverts. They may not give a good interview because that's just not them, but they're brilliant programmer and you want them on your team. Anyway, so companies need to have people with disabilities in their company, of course, qualified. I'm not just saying pick somebody off the street, of course. And don't forget, there's a lot of invisible disabilities. If I had never said a word in this panel, you wouldn't know I was deaf. You know it as soon as I'm talking. Anyway, so when you have people with disabilities in your company, we can come up with creative solutions. For example, I have an Apple Watch. When I bought it for fitness, not accessibility. And it turned out to be an amazing accessibility tool. And my favorite feature being, I would have never thought of this. We got the doorbell camera. So when somebody comes to the door, they don't even have to ring the bell. My phone vibrates. And then my watch also vibrates. So I know somebody's at the door. And one time it turned out to be my sister. I did not know she was coming over, and I didn't have my hearing aid on because my hair was wet. So thank goodness for that. So we can find clever, creative ways to use products, because so many products were not initially designed for people with disabilities, and they turned out to be a great accessibility tool.
Fabulous. So I think, knowingly, unknowingly, both Meryl and Dave have given us lots to go back and work with as organizations. So with that, I think we are really at the end of our conversation. So one last question to both of you. Advice to companies, startups, people that you would give to make, the world more accessible, and what would be your takeaways for our audience? So Meryl, over to you first, and then we'll go to Dave next.
Okay, so for a startup company, you're in the best position possible because you're building your company from the ground up. If you add accessibility and inclusion and universal design, you're going to be in a better place because you don't have to retrofit anything. You don't have legacy systems you're dealing with like the big companies do. So take the time to make accessibility part of your culture. Ingrain it and make an effort to try to hire broadly and look for accessibility, disability jobs boards and advertise there. Find out where people with disabilities are looking for jobs and post them. So you're in the best place possible because you don't have any history getting in the red. None of that. We've always done it this way.
Fabulous. Thank you for that. So Dave, the last word comes to you. What is the advice you would like to give our listeners?
I agree with everything that Meryl said about startups. They have the opportunity to build from scratch and to build both inclusively and with accessibility in mind. And therefore they don't build up that sort of technical debt that I was talking about earlier. For larger companies, for companies who have these legacy systems, it really just behooves you based on sort of the impact that we were talking about earlier in the conversation, but also just because it's the right thing to do, to think about refocusing accessibility as part of your efforts. And again, it means remediation. But the thing about accessibility from a remediation perspective is it doesn't have to happen all at once. I think that it's really important that if we just start to build up the muscle of building accessibly and educating more broadly across all the different teams to think accessibly and to work towards hiring inclusively and bringing people in inclusively to the teams. If you think about it as building muscle or exercise, it's not something that you do once. You don't run around the block and you're suddenly in shape. You've got to run around the block, 2-3 times a day for the rest of your life. So if companies take the approach to start at a point and simply move towards accessibility, that's 1,000 times better than not doing anything at all, right? And if it takes a little bit of time, it takes a little bit of time. Companies have to, organizations have to balance the amount of work they do to build new product and features and address issues with bugs with accessibility issues as well. And in that way, they can move towards accessibility. It's a repetitive problem, but by building up that muscle, eventually things are going to, anything built from scratch will start to be built accessibly because everyone will be aware of and educated on the problem.
Well, amazing thoughts from both of you. Would like to thank both of you for sharing your views. It has been an amazing conversation. I look forward to staying in touch with both of you, and I'm sure our viewers and listeners will also feel the same thing. So thank you for the amazing advice, Dave, as well as Meryl. Grishma, back to you.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. And one of the things that I was thinking about what Meryl was saying is if you take a word and you change the first letter, so from tuck, if you take the T and make it an S, or if you make it an F, oh dear Lord, the consequences of that. So thank you so much for sharing that with me. That was a huge insight for me as well. And with that, we are going to conclude this session.